Tatsuhiko Shibusawa liked translating books, mainly from French. He ended up on trial for that, on trial for about 8 years. Avant-garde and the Scandal, Japanese Zenye to Sugandaru, was the philosophy of Tatsuhiko Shibusawa, heretical aesthetics of the Japanese master of black magic, mummification, evil women, and a lot of other uncouth things. Despite his retrospective association with horror in Japan, Shibusawa began as a French translator fascinated by the global surreal and fantastic. Shibusawa had one hand in popularizing writers like Franz Kafka, Jorge Luis Borges, and William Burroughs in Japan, and the other hand in translating as many volumes of the freakish or fantastic as he could. He had a professed fascination with encyclopedias, like Pliny's Natural History, penning his own such as the notorious Notebook of Black Magic, Kuro Majutsu no Techo. It was his association with the Marquis de Sade, though, and thus sadomasochism, that brought him infamy, which became fame, in Japan. Shibusawa's legal attention granted him literary fame, but to this day, Shibusawa remains a rather particular author, rather provincial to Japan. Translations of his work into English can be counted on one hand. The Poe-like short story Fish Scales, Gyorinki, translated by Anthony H. Chambers, the brief review/essay, Woman, Narcissism, and Okamoto Kanoko, translated by Tomoko Aoyama and Barbara Hartley, then the longer Odyssey of Strange Encounters, the full-length novel Takauka's Travels, recently translated by David Boyd. Ironically, Takauka's Travels, Shibusawa's greatest novel and claim to fame, is his least representative work, as most of his prestige was founded on translations, reviews, essays, and his cycles of short stories. Takauka's Travels is the exception. It's an exceptional book in general, but it is Shibusawa's magnum opus solidified in fiction, not the rest of his career, which was very, very varied. There's also a scattering of translations, mostly essays, in Spanish and French. Appropriate enough, Shibusawa sees most of his interest in his own adopted tongue of French. Chinese actually is the only language where Shibusawa has seen extensive commercial translation, surprisingly. The rub, or whip, that the Japanese writer responsible for introducing so many Western obscurities and oddities into Japan has himself seen very little translation or exportation beyond Asia. Shibusawa declared it was darkness in things, or the quality of those things, that justified what he declared to be his draconian interest in both the fantastic and horrible. It was the impossible that overturned the coherence of the universe. Unlike the French encyclopedists, establishing the common in the world, Shibusawa's knowledge was like the Arabic encyclopedists that focused on what was uncommon or remarkable, the dragon hoarding treasures in its dark cave, full of bones and spewing smoke, waiting for the reader to enter. Tatsuhiko Shibusawa, occasionally erroneously translated as Takehiko Shibusawa, was the pen name of Tasuo Shibusawa. Born in 1928, Shibusawa was the descendant of Japanese industrialists, though his father was a rather unremarkable, though high-working bank functionary. During World War II, like many Japanese authors in youth, the young Shibusawa developed an acute preoccupation, if not obsession, with imminent death. It was not surprising. Unlike the others, though, Shibusawa's obsession would eventually crowd out all his political interests, focusing him totally on the state of death. It was Japan's defeat in the war, though, that crushed Shibusawa's original goal of being an aeronautical engineer, pushed him back towards his interest in French, and imbued him with a nihilism he would fill with aesthetic philosophy, books, art, and essays which would lead him to surrealism. Shibusawa's early translations would focus on introducing the French surrealists, like André Breton, Georges Bataille, and Antoine Artaud, as well as lesser-known figures of French literature, such as the poetess Marceline Desbordes-Valmore, to the post-World War II Japanese intellectual climb. The Japanese translation of Artaud's Heliogabalus, or The Crowned Anarchist, 1937, would be influential not only on Shibusawa, but also his close friend Yukio Mishima. Though, due to an earlier stymied interest in German, Shibusawa, Intellectually, was also later heavily influenced by Gustave René Hawk's 1957 study of the grotesque or monstrous in European art, the world as a labyrinth. Shibusawa himself was more or less a harmless, self-styled dandy with strange interests. Eroticism, utopianism, hermaphroditism, alchemy, diabolism, automaton, meaning puppets, secret societies, etc. Shibusawa, though, after youthful flirtations with leftism and Marxism, inspired by earlier Japanese realist authors, would grow flatly distasteful of politics in general and pronounce his dedication to European-derived mannerism, or blood and roses as he described it, a certain school of perennial art in Europe which Shibusawa believed best exhibited his ideal of eros. It was a complicated philosophy, though, that had to do with both life and death. It goes back to French, a certain term in French which one might be familiar with. Due to the inspirations of his French education, Shibusawa always retained a self-manicured Gothic or even decadent air, not unlike a Japanese Comte de Lautremont or ghastly Montague Summers. Shibusawa's fascination with encyclopedias and morbid miscellany, skulls and such, encouraged this. His standoffish public image akin to the stereotypical decayed, aloof aristocrat, pale, reclusive, vampiric, always wearing sunglasses and holding a tobacco pipe. Shibusawa even remarked upon the death of his father, and fallen house, childhood home, as if it was a victim of modernity he sent out into the cold. The destruction of that great house symbolized the end of an age. For me, personally, it meant that huge, dark old house, the source of so many of my childhood memories, had disappeared from the face of the earth. Shibusawa's writing style has been called a Pygmalionic universe because of its obsession with objects and the personality Shibusawa bestowed upon those objects. Jewels, puppets, poisons, and even murderers. A man who counted among his collection of personages those like Gilles de Rais and Elizabeth Báthory, the Countess Dracula. Shibusawa believed darkness was needed to round out the spiritual hungers of mankind. Modern society, technological society, had placed spirituality in the craftsmanship of things. The Japanese literary public then deemed Shibusawa Kanshu Shonen, or Bug Boy, due to his fascination with collecting things. The nickname Bug Boy, a reference to young boys who spent their summers gathering bugs, either for their own pleasure or to disgust people. Shibusawa himself often bearing a slight resemblance to a young boy, or maybe even a bug, due to his thick glasses and penchant for tinted sunglasses. Shibusawa delighted in introducing Japanese readers to European magical traditions of the left-hand path through works like The Notebook of Black Magic, 1961, The Notebook of Poison, 1963, The Notebook of Secret Societies, 1966, and Museum of Strange and Bewitching People, 1971. Shibusawa declared all these topics, and there were many more than those, were representations of decadence and aestheticism. His short fiction, which he developed in the later period of his career in the 1980s, made use of similar luscious exotic titles like Tales of the Arabesque, 1981, and The Sleeping Princess, 1983. As he had developed in his short-run magazine/manifesto, Chitobara, Blood and Roses, Shibusawa's books made extensive use of pictures and paintings from European artists. Thus, though not formatted as such, they were stylized like old encyclopedias and odd storybooks. Style was everything to Shibusawa, who could forgive shortcomings as long as the style was interesting. No surprise he would heavily influence both Japanese horror and black metal with that idea. He advocated for both Franz Kafka and Jorge Luis Borges, read both through French translation, alongside more obscure authors like the esoteric symbolist Josephine Paladin in Japan. The Western artists he advocated for, he had a certain penchant for the uncanny and nightmarish, some even fetishistic. Unsurprisingly, many of them were French, or Belgian. René Magritte, Paul Delaroche, Clovis Joyer, Pierre Molyneux, Keisai Eisen, and Shibusawa was credited with popularizing Hans Bellmer in Japan in 1965. If it was not already obvious by now, Shibusawa had a certain fascination with puppets, especially Hans Bellmer's sculptures. Shibusawa's introduction of Bellmer's work to Japanese literary culture being a likely predecessor to body horror in Japan. This was due to Shibusawa's passion for eroticism, or Irate Shijuma in Japanese. Most of Shibusawa's influential essays, favorites of Yukio Mishima and other Japanese artists like doll maker Yotsuya Simon, being penned on the topic. Shibusawa's eroticism was not a one-to-one equivalent of the Western concept, though, but it 100% included sexual elements like sadomasochism. Shibusawa, inspired by Gustav René Hawk's work on artistic mannerism, defined eroticism, in his philosophical language, as a metaphysical obsession towards the world and its structure. It was a complex, heavily French philological-inspired belief, colored with psychosexual theory. But Shibusawa's eroticism was perhaps more equivalent to a vital impulse, élan vital, or aesthetic desire. He argued there was an organic eroticism, humans and dance, and an eroticism of discontinuity, or artificial eroticism, puppets and avant-garde dance. Shibusawa's praise, he was a critic after all, of René Magritte's style identified what he sought in art, and especially painting. Even if a woman's nude is depicted, it is not for praising the radiance of sensuality, nor is it a projection of René's desires, feelings, subconsciousness, or complex. This cold nudity is simply nothing more than an object. Shibusawa's essays were insightful, on purpose, but that was part of the avant-garde and the scandal. He attached himself to dancer-slash-choreographer Tatsumi Hijikata, inventor of the performance art Buto, or Dance of Darkness, and Yukio Mishima, who was Yukio Mishima after all. Even later writing Mishima's obituary, Shibusawa being considered the conduit of the French literary world to contemporary Japanese writers, though, as Shibusawa declared on his own artistic tastes that heavily colored his translations, the ideal of eroticism is an art of visualizing the hallucination of death. It is not surprising Shibusawa's early career culminated with the translation of the Marquis de Sade then. It brought him fame, and then a nearly decade-long obscenity trial before the Japanese Supreme Court. The subject was Shibusawa's particular Japanese translation of de Sade's controversial, amoral Juliet, or Vice Amply Rewarded, sometimes called The Flourishing of Vice in Japanese. The book, infamous for depicting basically every crime and perversion wrapped in a philosophical novel colored by the context of the French Revolution. The authorities declared the issue was not that Shibusawa had translated the novel, one judge actually complimented the ability and tact of his translation, but that he had translated too little of the novel. See, Shibusawa had cut out the more philosophical bits and sections, estimated to be about 30% of the novel, which the Japanese law argued had reduced the novel to mere erotica. The judgment soon became more about context than exactly about the content. In April 1960, the police raided Shibusawa's publisher, confiscated all 162 copies of the translation's second volume for obscenity. Then, in January 1961, Shibusawa was indicted on Article 175 of the Japanese Penal Code for obscenity. Yes, that statement may sound somewhat ironic. Shibusawa did not endear himself to lower or higher courts, though, by his cold disdain throughout the trial. He wore his sunglasses throughout the trial, smoked his pipe without a care, and was more interested in the publicity the trial would bring him than the verdict, which he cared very little about. He was soon the darling of the Japanese literary world. Everyone was already playing into Shibusawa's hands because, as he wrote of such intent and infamy in the essay Dark Humor or Literary Terror, his purpose was to inspire the chaos and terror which arise from the destruction of the ancient regime. The exact grounds on which Shibusawa's translation of de Sade was persecuted are somewhat obtuse. They relied on an earlier standard where translator Saito had been tried for a Japanese translation of D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover in the 1950s. While indicted for obscenity, but even that was on and off and hard to prove, the judgment declared that Saito had been liable for obscenity because his translation of Chatterley had been too direct from the English version. Unlike obtuse medical textbooks, Ito's translation had been legible to the wider, less educated public, which suggested an intent to raise uncontrolled arousal. The public could dwell on certain warm passages and become a little more interested in them. Interesting to note, though, Ito had translated James Joyce's Ulysses into Japanese, a book that had been famously tried for obscenity in the United States, but escaped detention in Japan mostly. Ito's defense in the trial had not been helped by the fact that his publisher had included with his translation of Lady Chatterley's Lover a survey asking if the readers had become excited while reading it. 79.1% of readers answered yes, and 20.9% of readers replied no, if you're curious. While cheap erotica magazines proliferated freely in Japan since the early 1900s, and arguably even much earlier than that, the Japanese courts decided that both Ito and Shibusawa's translations tainted high art by associating it with low explicit material, or turning it into low explicit material. Cheap magazines were not a concern because they rarely lasted more than 3 issues. Shibusawa's magazine, for example, Chitabara, had only lasted for 4 issues, and he was only the editor for 3 of those. Unlike literature, which persisted in the hearts and minds, and thus, the Japanese courts declared, could taint the interests of people. Shibusawa was deemed responsible in his instance because his abridged translation of Desaad's novel altered both the content and context of the work, which, according to the courts, meant it was a new work which was simply mere erotica. The judges, though, hedged their judgment by declaring that though Shibusawa had besmirched literature with his purposeful non-inclusions, those sexual scenes are joined with scenes of brutality and ugliness, or portrayed immediately before or after such scenes. And the fact the book's plotting plot and purposely archaic language in translation meant ordinary person cannot but find it basically something of a pain to read through the whole book. It had been the mixture of offensive material, declared dangerous to the public, within the form of presentable literature, even if in a high language like classical Japanese poetry, which was the crime of Shibusawa's translation. While judged guilty, the enormous scandal ended with Shibusawa only fined 70,000 yen, more famous than ever, and in favor with the Japanese avant-garde. He was only annoyed the fine was so low in the end because the trial had robbed him of 8 or 9 years of his life in total. The mixture of crass low culture and high art would make Shibusawa the poster boy for Itan Bungaku, or deviant literature/studies, a mixture of aesthetics, horror, fantasy themes, and styles, not always related to the sensual, but that was an element in the definition. One dissenting judge on the Japanese Supreme Court inadvertently describing deviant literature through Shibusawa as searching for the truth about man, trying to draw out from depths of anguish filled with bitterness what it is that will shake the emotions of the reader. Paradoxically, Shibusawa moved away from actionable politics after the conclusion of the Desaad trial in 1969. He maintained a cold apathy towards the Anpo protests that dominated the discussions of the contemporary Japanese literary scene and new generation of writers throughout the 1960s and 1970s, though he retained political friends like literary critic Takaaki Yoshimoto. He declared his interest rested mainly, as an avant-garde aristocrat, in aesthetics and novels. I am not at all interested in the solution to questions like how one should live his or her life. Therefore, from the first, I turned away from literature of seeking the truth of life and only read aesthetic novels. A friend Yukio Mishima would later declare Shibusawa possessed the dandyism of an assassin. Until Mishima's militarized suicide in 1970, Shibusawa and Mishima remained close friends. Both were united by a classical interest in Greece and Rome, Mishima praising Shibusawa's essay on the decadence of the deranged Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius Antonius, the Mad Emperor Heliogabalus, or A Study of Decadence. Later, inspired by Shibusawa's translations and highly publicized trial, Mishima would also pen the stage play Madame Desaad, not only inspired by the historical Marquis de Sade's family, but also Shibusawa's essay commentary on him and his reputation. Their dynamic and the passion for Tatsumi Hijikata's Buto dance dominating the Japanese avant-garde for a period. The two authors, and their two differing styles, representing the interplay of the melancholic, Shibusawa, and choleric, Mishima, in literature, fantasy, and realism. Or, in Shibusawa's preferred esotericism, Mishima was the warrior to Shibusawa's magician. Mishima relished the limelight, and Shibusawa often felt forcibly thrust into publicity. After Mishima's controversial suicide, Shibusawa withdrew more and more from the public view to focus on essays and his later, last major novel. Shibusawa's fascinations post-1969 included classical and European history, botany, and geology. There too was a fascination with concentric objects and infinity, which Shibusawa took as microcosms or macrocosms of the world. He was often fascinated by the object inside the object inside the object repeating infinitely. He still occasionally dabbled in a morbid, aesthetic philosophy that colored his later fictions, a romanticizing strangeness. Collections with titles like The Cosmos Record of Dream, 1964, The World Inside a Walnut, 1974, and The Heraldry of Thought, 1977. Shibusawa's compendium, My Plinius, or My Pliny, being his commentary upon the work of Pliny the Elder, mainly the natural history, highlighting the fantastical and strange elements Pliny mentioned in his original work. Shibusawa's commentary taking special note of fantastical and grotesque things referenced by the Roman as if real, one-legged men, burning salamanders, and bizarre interpretations of elephants or other animals. His intent, like earlier compendiums, to blur the borders between history and legend, reality and fiction, orthodoxy and heterodoxy. Shibusawa's later essays highly interested, due to the influence of psychologist Miyamoto Taro, in examining the artistic contrast between men and women, a theme often touched upon but not developed in his earlier essays. One of Shibusawa's more idiosyncratic arguments, derived from Taro's work, being women's artistic sense was more prone to multiple personality disorder, while men were more prone to double personality disorder or a sort of doppelganger syndrome. Women with multiple substitute personalities were seers, psychics, and oracles, the gods being merely other personalities, but these women were prone to hysteria. Men projected another self outside themselves, enjoyed taking up false identities, but were prone to lapsing into Jekyll and Hyde-like paranoia. Due to technological civilization, Shibusawa believed, those traits were now projected onto objects in artwork which offered a conduit into the psychology of man. Draconia was the term Shibusawa used to describe his short stories, and often aesthetic ideals as well. He derived the term from the kanji in his name that represented dragon or imperial, ryu or tatsu. These stories, the Draconia cycle, focusing on Shibusawa's favorite deviant topics like assassination, poison, petrification, false history, unstable identities, and more, but also inspired by figures as widespread as Mary Stuart, Rasputin, and the Count Saint-Germain, all historical personages he had written essays on, beside others. Shibusawa's view towards everything was conceptual. He admitted this himself. It meant his world was nearly totally symbolic. In line with the odd luster of mannerism, blood and smoke, Shibusawa declared the purpose of nature was ornamentation, and creation, for him writing, was a pleasurable game to take part in. There was little more to it than that. Short stories like Fish Scales focused upon odd games and ghosts. That short story specifically about the obscure betting game of Wischspiel, the Dutch game of fish imported to Japan where it became the obsession of an untrustworthy leisure class. More grounded than Shibusawa's other tales, but it still indulges in genso, or hallucination/fantasy. Shibusawa identified the abrupt absurgence of fantasy, akin to a hallucination in Japanese, as that which inspires horror, the ghastly, the luxuriously impossible, and the grotesque. This meant to Shibusawa that the supernatural tale, as opposed to the realistic novel, was the perfect form of literature. As he said of this idea, for example, St. George faces a dragon in Cappadocia. Of course, the dragon was a representation of fear for the people of that same time. However, that fear was like the representation of terror towards the natural world, and today for us, perhaps it would not be so different from the fear of seeing a lion. Or perhaps it is better to compare it to the fear of the Loch Ness Monster of Scotland. The hero fights the dragon and is able to defeat it. This corresponds to the fairy world. However, what if the enemy is not a dragon, but a ghost? Even for someone like a hero, bravery may not be useful against a ghost. That is, the ghost that cannot be in this world exists by manifesting from that world. Its existence arises because it has abruptly invaded into this world. This is the panic of the unknown. In the world of horror novels of the modern era, this is the world of the fantastic. From his theories, stories, and obsessions arose Shibusawa's final, and only major, recently translated, novel, Takauka Shino Kokaiki, Prince Takauka's Travels. The book an odyssey, more or less a dream odyssey, which follows a fictionalized version of the Prince Imperial Takauka's attempts to reach the Buddhist Holy Land of India across Asia in the 800s. The historical Japanese prince went missing on his own Buddhist pilgrimage to India, but Shibusawa's prince makes it to Hindustan or Henjiku, India, in a certain fashion, one much in line with Shibusawa's tastes. Takauka, much like the author, obsessed with India as an inverse dream country where day is night, summer is winter, water flows backwards, and women have the bodies of birds. The fantastic and horrible is very tangible in the book. The book, or novel, more a series of episodes, likely inspired not only by Shibusawa's interests, objects like mirrors, petrified bodies, and jewels are aplenty, but also his later trips to Europe and the Middle East. The prince, for example, considers himself a pretty able dreamer, like Shibusawa, and is joined on his odyssey by two wise monk companions, then later a mysterious third, a child, probably representing the wisdom of Buddhism. The prince himself a heterogeneous representation of Japanese traditions and optimistic curiosity, perhaps a little too curious. The novel seesaws between playful and nightmarish, embracing as many fantastical elements as dreams, conception by lightning, ghosts, ghost ships, mirrors, even kinda time travel, obscure Asian history, historical anachronisms. Columbus is mentioned 600 years early, then all the characters forget about it, and even complicated Japanese wordplay. For each chapter title, Shibusawa chose unfamiliar kanji and obtuse combinations for each chapter to give a curious clue to what bizarre creature or object the chapter will revolve around. The book then has elements of speculative fiction combined with a moving encyclopedia of curiosities, but it's also sort of a fantastical odyssey across this bizarre image of the world, highlighted with creatures and wonders. Chapter 4 includes one of the more entertaining episodes. After wandering into the jungle on the Arakan coast, today here, the travelers find a man laughing at them for eating bamboo shoots like panda bears. The man turns out to actually be a grotesque, a dog-headed man who is actually horribly depressed, not only because he has a bell tied to his private parts, but because he knows all dog-headed men will be hunted to extinction because he can see the future. Literally, he has a second sight that allows him to see the future. When the prince and retainers doubt his dog-headed story, though, the dogman continues to jabber at them. "A day will come when tales of a kingdom of dog-headed men will reach every corner of the world. It's already set in stone, I'm afraid." His tale, true, because he can see the future, beside being carried by Prince Takauka, will also be carried by Ibn Battuta, Marco Polo, Odoric, Carpini, and Hayton, the story later peddled by Sir Mandeville across all of Europe. One can see how much Shibusawa enjoyed crossing cultures and creating new contexts for fabulous stories. The dog-headed man is simply a microcosm of the world beyond the map, the strange creature Shibusawa was obsessed with. By the end, the novel was literally Shibusawa's voice. After months of being hospitalized with throat pain, in February 1986, Shibusawa was diagnosed with cancer of the hypopharynx in the midst of writing the novel. In his dying days, and in the last few chapters, Shibusawa found this appropriate to his decadent tastes. He began to call himself the voiceless Taoist as he lost his ability to speak. It was only him and nature. He was now an object which united beauty and death, the perfect mannerist spectacle in his own perspective. "The swelling in my throat is caused by a beautiful pearl I swallowed. Since the pearl is stuck in my throat, I cannot make a sound. Therefore, I call myself Don Juan, Pearl Swallowing Hermit, or Donju Bose Kyoshi, retired scholar of swallowing a pearl and losing voice. When I was a child, I once swallowed my father's golden cuff button by mistake. Therefore, calling myself Don Juan seems appropriate to my nature. Also, the pronunciation of Don Juan is similar to the Spanish debauchee Don Juan. I think that is also not bad at all." Near the end of the novel, then, Prince Takauka becomes a complicated mixture of the historical personage, a Buddhist pilgrim, dreamer, and even Shibusawa himself. Shibusawa's attempt to rectify the instincts of magician, aesthetic, and Superman through one character. Though, as Shibusawa even admits through the plot, it's not exactly successful. There's a profound sadness there is still much unfinished. A pearl lodged in the prince's throat is slowly killing him as he draws closer and closer to India. On his death march, or maybe a dying dream, he meets again many of the characters and figures he has crossed through his journey. Prince Takauka rejects immortality in either soul or mummification, and instead ends the book by embracing a very Buddhist moral instilled by the parable of Prince Sattva and the tigers. In August 1987, Shibusawa himself would pass away due to an aneurysm of the carotid artery, due to the aforementioned throat cancer. His favorite editor was later buried near him as, before Shibusawa's death, they had promised to exchange one last word they were never able to. only in death. Shibusawa's odyssey was over, but the voyage of his work is far, far from over. Like the Prince, it still has oceans to cross. Versions of his work can be accessed online through the Draconia WebWiki, if one can read Japanese. Shibusawa has actually seen extensive translation into Chinese. Really, Shibusawa's influence on not only Japanese horror fantasy, but also wider modern Asian horror fantasy, personification, puppets, and paradoxes is very extensive. Meanwhile, in English, well, there was nearly a 40-year gap between the translation of the short story Fish Scales and Takauka's Travels. Unfortunately, most of Shibusawa's essays and fiction remains untranslated, if not nearly all of it, so he is more or less a ghost in the West, unlike the grotesque he would want to be and those he wrote about. Though there is an element that most of what Shibusawa was famous for was translation, so in the end, you'd just be translated translation. But isn't there a kind of fantastic irony in that? Shibusawa said it was those gross subjects that attracted him because there must be some secret link between them, some world of darkness or some other world. Hopefully, there will not be another 40 years to wait and see that secret link beyond Japan again. Perhaps, in the end, we are all tigers carrying something, if not dragons. Okay, so if you're not subscribed, but please do so, you're probably here because this character from Bungo Stray Dogs, named after Tatsuhiko Shibusawa. Tatsuhiko Shibusawa from Bungo Stray Dogs, this character, actually shows up in more searches than the actual Shibusawa when you search his name. This is not the only character author this happens to either. Interestingly enough, both of them are Japanese. The character, though, is a very open homage to Shibusawa, so I think it is pretty cool, but from what I understand, that's the point of the series, to pay homage to authors through anime powers. I just find it absolutely hilarious how the namesake and the character look nothing alike. Like, look, long white hair versus short black hair, you couldn't possibly get any different. In a certain manner, I'd like to give a thank you to my supporters, Violinon, and an anonymous patron.